I want to suggest that the collapse of an authentic liturgical piety is very much rooted in taking sacred scripture out of its sacral context. What are your thoughts on that?
I wish I were a cheerleader with pom-poms to give you a shout-out. I mean, I've not heard anybody put it that way except for me. You put it better than I do.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. As always, let's start with prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Almighty God, through the intercession of St. Ignatius Loyola, we ask that you pour forth your Holy Spirit upon us, a spirit of discernment, that we might hear your voice and obey your command. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, friends, regular listeners to the show know that I'm a longtime university and seminary professor, having taught philosophy and theology for many years, and I stumbled upon an older article with an intriguing title called College Without Truth. That's not the way it was, in my day. That's not how we talked. I saw that it was trending that way, and we're definitely there now. I was able to track down the author. She's senior fellow and director of high school programs for the Zephyr Institute Center for the Study of First Principles. Just the job title alone grabbed my eye. Dr. Molly Oshatz, welcome to the Catholic Current.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Dr. Oshatz, when I started as a freshman in, 1979, one of the appeals of a university education, and especially a liberal arts humanistic education, was you can find the truth and you can dispute with people, but to do so as allies, because what you had in common was the search for truth, even if you had enduring disagreements. It's not that way anymore, though, is it?
No, and my experience, it's certainly not that way everywhere. And I have had some teaching experience where it did seem to be that way. But I think there's a lot of pressure, various pressures in academia and the liberal arts especially these days, that push it in a very different direction, where truth is actually not what's being pursued. It's what may be being assumed or explained away, but not what's being pursued. And I found that really frustrating when I was a university professor.
Why did it frustrate you?
Well, I would be in the classroom, and it was really hard to lead a discussion. I was a professor in intellectual history, and it'd be really hard to lead a discussion about ideas when no one will disagree, right? So, so I'd try to start something, try to start some sort of debate to get at a deeper truth. And, sometimes you'd have some students speak up that had, very bravely, that had a different belief than the majority had. And they would do so often tentatively in a language that maybe didn't match, maybe wasn't entirely commensurate with what the other people were using, and they would get shut down. Not even shut down with respect, just shut down like, oh, did no one explain to you? That's not something you can say. Like, no, without even any attempt at dialogue. And so I would, and I'm trying to do two things at once. One, I'm trying to show the people that have this assume they have the only legitimate belief, that they probably don't really know that belief very well. They probably do not know their own mind as well as they think they do. Because if you know something just because it's the water you swim in, you tend actually not to have thought about it and learned how to defend it. So even if someone has even if this belief that they're all sharing is correct, I want them to know how to understand it more deeply and defend it. So I'm trying to sort of tease out exactly what it is they're thinking, which is irritating them because it's like, this isn't controversial. This is just what everyone thinks, right? And at the same time, I'm trying to bring up this other perspective in order to highlight that there is another way of looking at this. There actually could be a debate here. But I would lose the person that I was hoping would defend this other belief because they're wading in and realizing they're going to get attacked. And they don't have the language even to articulate this belief in academic language or, in something other than purely personal language. For instance, they're bringing a religious perspective. They might start quoting the Bible or something in a class, that's a secular university class, and everyone's just like, wait, what the heck are you talking about? I mean, that's not the language they need to be using to enter into this debate. so I would lose both sides kind of. And then, and as I said in this article, like if you start, I would then say, well, let me just play the devil's advocate, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you do that enough in a classroom, they really start to think maybe you're not just playing, you know, that you're just, there's
Eventually
something wrong with you.
Right.
And
right.
you lose them. So that, you know, that to me is such essential. That setup is so essential to teaching history or teaching a lot of different disciplines of liberal arts. So you're finding at the deepest level, like what is at stake. And I found that to be more and more difficult to do, to the point of being impossible, because a truth was assumed. You know, if you're in a lot of liberal arts disciplines now, right, is, you know, the only truth that matters, we just assume. So they say that's racial, gender, ethnic equality. Well, that's just an assumed truth. That's not to be questioned, of course. And then we go about and we apply that truth to these texts. And if we see something that makes us uncomfortable, we can historicize that away. We can say, oh, that's not really true because, well, that's a belief that came about through these historical processes. So that can be relativized and explained. So you're never actually grappling with truth. And that's what I was there to do. So, yeah.
No, Doctor, I'm right there with you. Friends, my guest today is Dr. Molly Oshatz. She's Senior Fellow at the Zephyr Institute Center for the Study of First Principles. I was very fortunate. If I believed in reincarnation, I would say that my late great mentor, Dr. Paul Weiss, was the reincarnation of Socrates. So here I am at the School of Philosophy of the Catholic University of America, and my mentor is a non-observant Jewish metaphysician. So I was taught to pursue truth both passionately and dispassionately. I can pursue it passionately with zeal, but dispassionately, that I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to discover the truth, even a truth with a capital T. And as I started teaching, I realized that was absolutely unwelcome. And you know, as you can imagine, that it affected ministry as well. But it was really clear that the students had come with the expectation that they were participating well if they spoke audibly, and to be shown to be wrong, or that one could do a better job at explaining the truth, that might hurt one's feelings, and what could possibly be worse than that. Can we begin to have a sense of where did that come from? Did the students bring that relativism to the classroom, or was that part of the initiation process at the university?
That's a really good question. I mean, there are two ways to get that I'd like to pursue. One, you know, I do a lot of work with high school students, and at least the high school students I work with, I don't see that at all. You know, they are, and we're not doing for-credit work, right? So they're outside of the classroom, kind of. I mean, they're not getting any, classroom credit for any course credit for what we're doing. So it's just an elective. It's a free thing that they get to spend their time doing, and they are absolutely there to get at the truth. So I don't think it's something that they are bringing with them in terms of their deepest desires. Mm-hmm. I think it might be something that that these are the guardrails that they've been given. You know, that this is what they need to do to pursue education safely. I mean, this is, for many reasons, a very risk-averse generation, and that is not actually on them entirely. They are caught up in a pretty brutal meritocracy, where they are it's been often demonstrated to them that they're being sorted in their every action, and that there is not a lot of room for failure and for displeasing professors. Right? That's a weird irony of the university system these days, that they talk so much about inclusion, but the bread and butter of elite universities is exclusion. You know, is they are barring the gates except for the few worthy few that enter the doors. And there is this is a very anxious generation. That success is felt by them, I think, to be a very narrow thing. That you have to play by certain rules to gain. So I think that a lot of it is just that inherent risk aversion of sensing that that many of their teachers have had this underlying message of this is what educated people believe, and you certainly don't want to define yourself out of those parameters. So there's a sort of speaking your truth might seem, actually, I think, not your truth, but speaking up for what you deeply believe might, I think, for lots of these kids seem like kind of a non sequitur. Like that's a luxury item. It's not something they've been trained to do necessarily, and it's not something they've been allowed to expect as something they should be getting in education. So there's that. but then there's a larger story of how the university got there,
Right.
and why the university isn't kicking and screaming towards holding on. This is the liberal arts. That should be what they're entirely about. That's their that's their justification.
That's their heritage. Yes.
Why have they abandoned that heritage? And that's a longer story. That's a story about how we got here, which I could certainly delve into.
Well, the rot set in a lot earlier than most people think. Ignatius Press recently republished a book called Poor Old Liberal Arts, and the Jesuit author there, who's classically trained in Oxford, he traces a lot of the rot, at least in the United States, back to World War I. So the idea that there was a golden era, within living memory, isn't true. And I think we've been progressively moving away from truth for a very long time, and that is a very complicated story. Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Molly Oshatz. She is Senior Fellow and Director of High School Programs at the Zephyr Institute Center for the Study of First Principles. I'm responding to her article from a few years back called College Without Truth. In the next segment, we're going to ask the question, does diversity cancel truth? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Remember, our rallying cry here at the Catholic Current is Christus Mundo, Mundus Christo, bringing Christ to the world and the world to Christ. We do it because our Lord says so, for the greater glory of God, the love of our neighbor, and the salvation of our own soul. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Everything you need to keep the conversation going among your family and friends we give to you. Together, let's take it around the world. We can do it with you. We certainly cannot do it without you. Friends, we'll be back in just 2 minutes. Please do stay with us. This is Jesuit Father Robert McTague, your daily host for the Catholic Current. Join me at 5 p.m. Eastern for another special Friday episode. Just when you think you've heard it all, how about this? Want a baby? Get the app. That's right, we'll be looking at a case of online pregnancy. We'll wrap up the show with weekend readiness, reviewing the headlines of the week to get you ready for Sunday Mass. That's the Catholic Current at 5 p.m. Eastern on Friday, coming to you from the Station of the Cross and the iCatholic Radio mobile app.
You're listening to the Catholic Current with Father Robert McTague from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Stay connected with the show, our guests and topics, by following the show on Twitter and Gab. Just search for The Catholic Current.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. You know, I'm a long-standing professor of philosophy and theology. I like to wax eloquent about higher education when I can. My guest today is Dr. Molly Oshatz. She's Senior Fellow at the Zephyr Institute Center for the Study of First Principles, responding to an article she wrote a little while back called College Without Truth. Doctor, I'm sure you've attended many meetings, as I have, where someone would pronounce diversity is our strength, and everyone would nod. And I'd be inclined to put up my hand and say, does that mean you're going to be hiring traditionalist Catholics for the sociology department, Republicans for the politics department, and a Shakespeare scholar for the literature department? And I already knew the answer to that question. So when diversity is our strength, it doesn't mean diversity of opinion or perspective or thought, does it?
No, absolutely not. That's not how it's functioning. It comes from a perspective that what we want to do is just bring more people to the table, but not for the sake of pursuing truth, but for its own sake. So it's very odd to me because the university speaks that diversity and inclusion as first-order goods, but they don't make a particle of sense as first-order goods, particularly because we're not talking about a diversity of belief or diversity of commitment. We're talking about ethnic diversity, religious diversity, gender diversity, and so on, skin deep kind of diversities. I mean, no one says it doesn't really make any sense. It's like, I just want to be surrounded by people that look as different as possible from me, as many different walks of life as possible, just for that, just for that. I mean, it's just not a first order good. You want that for some other good, right? And it doesn't make any sense to say, like, this university its mission should be inclusion, because we want to include as many possible people as possible in this project that's about inclusion. I mean, that's the snake biting its own tail. That makes no sense. They're just not first order good. So I think when you see people talking about diversity and inclusion as first order goods, that means that, there's something going on here. Like, there's some lack of clarity about what this institution is really about. That's either, that's being either gilded or covered up, or maybe the institution has forgotten what it's really about. And I think maybe both of those were going on here.
Well, I remember several years ago, there was some senior officer in an HR department, a very prominent corporation. It might have been Apple. She said, you can have 10 men in the room and they all can be white and blonde and blue-eyed, and yet they can be a diverse group, because you could have a Christian, an atheist, a gay man, a heterosexual man, a liberal, a conservative, et cetera, et cetera. Diversity is more than just appearance, and she got fired. So whatever diversity means, diversity of opinion is not enough. So I remember some years ago attending a graduation party for a friend's cousin who graduated from actually a very prominent Catholic school. And the booklets they produce at graduation where it lists all the doctoral dissertation topics. And I was thumbing through, and except for a few physics dissertations and a few math dissertations, it was looking at traditional topics from a particular niche perspective, left-handed Elvis personators or something like that. And it was a perspective which led to the declaration of a grievance. So it seemed to me at that time higher education was moving in the direction of ginning up people with complaints rather than people of competence and character pursuing the truth. Is that a jaundiced view on my part, or have you seen a similar trend?
Yeah, I could see. I think part of what's going on with that, and I do see that, is the university searching for moral authority. And it used a long time ago, its moral authority was from religion, obviously, and then that was replaced by science, which obviously science is still the moral authority in science. It's been the liberal arts that fell apart for many reasons. And so then it's kind of set ashore. What is the basis of the moral authority of the university? It has to be more than just providing, candidates for job positions or preparing people for the job market. And lately, I think what it draws on is actually the civil rights movement. I think the civil rights movement is this movement. It was such a movement of such intense moral merit that it's like it established a treasury of merit that, kind of like the church, you get, indulgences can draw on that treasury. In the university, if you want to proclaim something as having a moral mission, something that transcends just economic preparedness, you draw on that treasury.
Right.
And the way you do that is by extending that movement to more and more classes of victim, more and more victims, more and more, search for new forms of group rights, new forms of diversity and inclusion. But because that's where that moral merit's coming from, it has to be kind of on that paradigm. So it has to be in terms of a group that has been marginalized or oppressed because of some outward characteristic. So that doesn't apply to say diversity of belief, diversity of fundamental.
So the complement to that, I said that that treasury of merit of victimhood, that only works if there is a readily identifiable class of oppressors, and that tends to be people of European descent, especially if they're male, even more so if they're Christian. Is part of the cult of victimization also a cult of villainization?
Yeah, I think you actually have to have a scapegoat if you have victims. So yeah, I think unquestionably. I find it fascinating too. It seems kind of like a transvaluation of Christian categories too. I mean, it's hard to imagine any culture that wasn't a Christian culture having such a fascination with victimhood. It's in a way, it's kind of a form of heresy. It's taking, we see the victimhood of Christ, but that's not the whole story, right?
Right.
But it's taking that chunk and making victimhood itself somehow holy and exalted. And so, yeah, you want to claim that ground because if you're not in the victimhood ground, then you're on shaky ground because you could be a villain. So, we
Right.
also talk about awareness of one's privilege. Like that's the new form of awareness is sin. That's another transvaluation is,
Right.
Be aware of that villainy in you that you can never shake. You'll always be a villain.
It is a kind of
but you have to
original
carry it
sin,
around.
and there is no baptism
Yes.
to wash
And there's
to
no
wash that stain
redemption.
away.
There is no forgiveness. There is no, exactly.
Well, when I see the villain class being identified, and then they have to make some public act of contrition, I think back to Mao's Cultural Revolution, where the Red Brigades would grab the bourgeoisie or the counter-revolutionary, whatever they were labeling the villain group that week, and they would have struggle sessions, and the guilty person would confess his guilt, and if he wasn't sufficiently histrionically contrite, they would beat the stuffings out of him to inspire more profound and abject declarations of guilt. We haven't quite gotten there yet, literally. I'm thinking, though, that higher education is moving in that direction. Am I misreading that, or are you seeing a trend in that direction too?
Well, I'm hoping we're not actually going to have people beaten physically, but I do. Yeah, I do see. I think for a while there we were talking a lot about the religious nuns, as in NONES. I think we're looking at something different now, and it's just sort of an awareness that there's no such thing as religious nuns. People all have their religion.
Sure.
And need that, that sense of what transcends us, that could be a driving purpose that's beyond an individual life, and it's become politics for a lot of people.
Right. Sure.
So what's interesting is while there's been this abandonment of the idea of truth at the capital T at the university, there's doubling down on the idea of good with a capital G. It's just goodness that has no distinct link to truth, which seems to be a very dangerous thing because it doesn't seem to work with limits. So I could see your fear that what is the limit here? Like, where does this head if the currency is purity and innocence? And that can be found in victimhood, and that demands an aggressor and a villain. That's a cycle that needs to be interrupted.
Well, I think of cancel culture. I think of speakers of a certain political stripe, come to a state campus, and then there were bomb threats, or they're shouted down, or they're pelted with food, or a professor, even a professor with tenure, gets fired. Because he committed a thought crime in social media, or I think of again, speaking as a Catholic priest, the issue of abortion is very dear to my heart, and so you might have people have a little shrine or memorial to the unborn who died through abortion, and then those shrines or little mementos get knocked over or torn down. So I do think there is a sense of moving towards violence. In the Antifa movement, they said, hey, we used to celebrate Captain America beating up the fascists. Why can't we beat up the fascists now? Of course, I haven't yet met someone who's upset about fascism who can give an accurate definition of fascism. Apparently, the rough and ready definition of fascism is whoever I don't like is the fascist, and if you really don't like them, you call them a member of the Taliban as well. Doctor, we're going to open up a big can of worms here. At the root of it, there's a relativism. We can't really know the truth with a capital T, so all we can talk about instead is grievances. How does that knowledge relativism, that epistemological relativism, lead to a moral relativism?
Yes. So, and first of all, I don't really think there are any moral relativists. There are these true nihilists out there, but they're very rare. There are a lot of people that are moral relativists regarding sexuality. But if you leave that area, you'll find we actually live in a way this is like a puritanical conversation. There's a lot of shaming and a lot of denunciation. It's intensely moral, but not, again, connected to truth. So I think the epistemological relativism is the really damaging form of relativism here. And the way this works is that there's no objective truth that transcends my perspective and yours. So if I'm having a disagreement with somebody, if there's objective truth, even if we can't necessarily grasp all of it, of course, in this life, we can get closer. So our disagreement could serve a purpose outside of us that could help both of us, even if it becomes somewhat heated. But if that doesn't exist, if there is no truth that transcends both of our perspectives that exists objectively, then if I disagree with you, how do I distinguish persuasion from aggression? I have nothing to persuade you of that's outside the both of us. So if I'm saying, hey, you're wrong, I think, what I'm saying isn't there's something, you're further from the truth than you should be. I'm saying you should take my perspective. I'm negating you. It's an act of aggression. It's a power move. So you can't have civility and this epistemological relativism unless you surround yourself with people who share your perspective. And you can't demand that, you can't force that to happen through a rational agreement, through, through trying to convince them of your perspective, because again, that's a meaningless activity. So you do it through shaming, name calling, you do it.
And then ultimately violence. In my book, Real Philosophy for Real People, I warn against the rationalist fallacy that says, if only I explain myself clearly enough, people will understand and then they will agree. And I've learned over the years that's a trail of tears. And when you start a statement with "you would think that," then you would know that you're very likely moving in the direction of the rationalist fallacy. Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Molly Oshatz. She's Senior Fellow and Director of High School Programs at the Zephyr Institute Center for the Study of First Principles. We're talking about college without truth. In the next segment, we're going to ask the question, can tolerance tolerate conflict? I think the short answer is no. We're going to look into a deeper answer as well. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcasts. Wherever you can find audio, you can find us. Follow us on your favorite platform. Write a 5-star review. We need to attract the attention of the algorithms so that these conversations get the attention they deserve. Together, let's take this around the world. We'll be right back. Please do stay with us.
This is The Catholic Current from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Catch up on an episode you've missed or share them with your family or friends. The Catholic Current is podcasted wherever you enjoy listening. Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. My guest today is Dr. Molly Oshatz. She's Senior Fellow and Director of High School Programs at the Zephyr Institute Center for the Study of First Principles. We're talking about an article she wrote called College Without Truth. In this segment, we're going to talk about whether or not tolerance can tolerate conflict. Doctor, some years ago when I was studying theology in London, we were in a seminar on ecclesiology, the theology of the church, and I quoted the author Walker Percy when he was asked, "Why are you still Catholic?" And he answered, "Well, what else is there?" Well, after class, Sister pulled me aside. She didn't pull my ear, but I think she wanted to. And she said, "Hans is from Germany. He's a Lutheran, you know. How do you think he felt?" And I said, I don't know. He didn't tell me, but if he's interested in finding the truth, I imagine he would feel just fine. And that did not seem to be the answer that he's looking for. Tell us your experience in academia about the cult of tolerance, and is it really intolerance masquerading as tolerance?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think so. The university, when it headed in the direction of multiculturalism and epistemological relativism, what works about that university is that it seems like this great strategy for responding to increasing racial and ethnic diversity and religious diversity on campus. You just can bring more and more people in, and because you don't have to agree about anything, there's really no danger of disagreement either. It's like the food court model of the university. So you can walk in and everyone is free to set up their kiosk. And isn't that lovely? You can bring in all these different perspectives and no one is having conflict because all of them can be true at the same time in their own way. It's not really truth, but everyone can bring in their perspective. So it's a way of accepting diversity without the threat of conflict. So the thing that doesn't work about that is that there's an enormous amount of conflict avoidance that's also motivating that. So diversity, in a way, is working at odds with diversity of belief. So there's this weird irony there where, abandoning objective truth in the name of university leads to this intolerance of actual diversity of commitment. So the more you're embracing diversity to promote toleration, to promote cooperation, if you're undermining that kind of discourse that you can have with truth as a third party to your conversation,
right,
then you're actually creating this climate of increasing suspicion and conflict and shame that works against any form of disagreement or actual intellectual diversity.
Yeah,
I think there's a dynamic there.
If you can't argue your way to the truth, then really the only thing left ultimately is force. Now, if you've got a student who's got very much a minority opinion, truth is good, for example, and it can be known, and truth obliges conscience, and then he has to live with people and eat 3 meals a day with people who find that position inimical, there's going to be enormous social pressure on him to cave. And now imagine he's a young academic who wants to get a grant or is applying for tenure. He's certainly not going to be talking about truth with a capital T, because that's really not a career enhancer as well. If present trends continue, if a college seems to be committed towards an intolerant tolerance, and where even truth with a small t isn't welcome, where are we likely to go from here?
Well, that brings up the work of Zephyr. I mean, that's a huge part of why we exist.
Okay, tell us about that. That student is able to go to an institute like Zephyr, and there are other institutes like Zephyr at other universities. We happen to serve Stanford, but these places exist throughout the country at elite research universities, where he's able, or she is able, to go to a gathering and see what the classroom looks like when there is a pursuit of the truth and the good and the beautiful, to see what that conversation looks like, and then to learn to expect that conversation when they go back to a different seminar or a different classroom, or maybe that's not what's happening. So we're modeling it and making it normal, right? Mm-hmm. And then also providing that network. So when that person does go to apply for a job or to graduate school or whatever it is, there are people to support them, to keep them in the institution, because we do need people to go to graduate school and become professors who do want to restore the university to the transcendence, to transcendental, to what it's there for, to pursue truth. So that's a lot of the work of Zephyr, is providing support for those very people, so that, because you're right, I mean, if you're constantly being forced to translate your core commitments into something that's much weaker, or to hide them, then eventually it becomes a private concern. And I'm not just talking about religion being privatized. It's your entire orientation towards being that ends up being privatized and shrunken. And that's not sustainable. Right. So a lot of this is just the work of bringing this out in public and showing how this is done, because there is a deep hunger amongst students for these conversations. It's not, this isn't work. This is what they want, so many of them. It's what they deeply want when they go to college. Well, I found when I was teaching ethics, and I used Francis Beckwith's book called Feet Planted Firmly in Midair, and I said, in 2 weeks I can teach you how to be an anti-relativist ninja. A lot of these kids, their eyes would light up, and they said, oh my gosh, I can't wait to go home for Thanksgiving dinner and put the smack down on Uncle Joe, who's been such a smart aleck about relativism for so long. I think there are students who find making truth commitments to be alarming, to be frightening, to be unsettling. A big concern I have with this cult of tolerance, which is really, I think, an intolerance with attitude, is that it leads to a lot of self-censorship. And then when I think of self-censorship, I'm immediately thinking of the Soviet Union and Solzhenitsyn and so on, and Václav Havel and Czechoslovakia. Is that a concern for you too, that if students aren't taught how to pursue the truth and defend the pursuit of the truth, you're going to end up with acquiescence and self-censorship?
Yes. I mean, I think we live in a time of self-censorship. I used to write more. I find it terrifying to write for the public right now, to be honest. And I can, this generation gets a lot of flack for things like pursuing safe spaces. I totally get why you'd want a safe space. If you were, you mentioned the kid that, had to share his dorm room with lots of people that disagree with them. But they're not just sharing their dorm room. They're on social media constantly. There is no escape from these echo chambers and from this risk of being outed and shamed and rejected. It's constant. So yeah, it's absolutely a terrifying thing. And that is almost in any community these days. It's not just community on the left. There's this sense of like, there are these lines that if you cross them, you're out. And that shaming dynamic absolutely is silencing. And it doesn't even help the agendas that are supposedly supported by it. Because, one thing I find actually is conservative students on campus come out knowing their beliefs and being able to defend them much better if they're on a more liberal campus than liberal students do. Because, I don't agree with John Stuart Mill about everything, but he's right about this, that the more you have to defend your beliefs in reasoned language, the better and the stronger they get. Like, you hew away the stuff that you find out actually wasn't defensible, and you get better at it. So all of this isn't even serving the dominant view, because these kids aren't ever having to defend what they actually believe. Even years ago, when I was teaching as a grad student at Berkeley, I found that students were really bad at defending democracy and freedom and basic liberal thought, right? So if we're, to the extent we're having this shame culture as allowed to infect academia, it's weakening everybody.
Yes, indeed. Friends, I'm speaking with Dr. Molly Oshatz. She's Senior Fellow and Director of High School Programs at the Zephyr Institute Center for the Study of First Principles. Doctor, when I was teaching classical rhetoric, I found that students could pick up this skill of competent speech, making a good persuasive speech. I found, though, that when you asked them to answer a question, they collapsed. That they can kind of learn their lines and learn the techniques, but they haven't thought through the issue in a way that they could mine it and own it and then defend it. I imagine that's a concern for the Zephyr Institute as well. How does your institute address that lack?
Well, I do that a lot in my work with high school students, because that's the time where you really should be learning those basic skills. It's funny, schools talk a lot now about teaching critical thinking, and that should be what they're teaching. That is critical thinking, but I don't know that that's always what's taught under that norm. But that's the work of a classroom to me, is doing that, is bringing out that ability that when you state something, we stop and you defend it, right? That you can, that we set up the situation in which you do have to learn to elaborate and to stand your ground. But I don't. It is hard to do that once students are much older. It's a skill that needs to be picked up at kind of a younger age. But that should be the work of the classroom. And I think Stanford probably does a pretty good job of that. I mean, I think some of these weaknesses are coming from weaker institutions who actually have more pressure on them in a way to hew to a party line. Right. Because that's how they can prove their worth and their inclusion in the larger community.
Well, I used to cause a stir among my students at the beginning of the semester. I'd say, we can argue passionately, but if you preface a statement with, I feel that, I'm going to interrupt you and tell you that I don't care. I want to know, what can you argue for, what can you prove, and where can you find support for your assertion based on the assigned reading. And the idea that actually doing the reading was required, that was something of a novelty for them. Where do we begin to push back against the intolerance of tolerance and the absolutism of relativism? Is I'm thinking it may be too late even in high school. What's your experience been?
Yeah, I think one of the earliest things to introduce, that we all just have to go back to, it seems like an obvious basic, is regaining a belief in shared human nature, right? And believing that there is something called human experience, that there's a we, that becomes before all these other group divisions that we've become so profoundly interested in. And that it means something to say we. Otherwise, why are you reading novels? Why are you reading philosophy? Why are you studying history? If you're just doing it to do politics, go do politics, right? This is the lousy way to do politics. What we're about is learning about the human experience. And then, and again, I think it's common sense. So you're right. I think it could start at a very young age, is connecting that to the true and the good and the beautiful. I mean, those are the actual first order goods, right? And those are irreducible dimensions of human experience. And you can't speak truthfully or compassionately or interestingly about human experience if you can't discuss those except as a mask for something else that's doing some institutional work at the time, whether that's diversity or inclusion or whatever it is. So it's just bringing back those conversations without apology. Like, I'm going to talk about truth. I'm going to talk about what's good. I'm going to talk about what's beautiful. And I'm not going to, try to ground it in some scientific fact. I'm also not going to ground it in this language of diversity and inclusion. I'm just going to speak this. It speaks directly to the human experience. And that is powerful in and of itself. It has its own power. So yes, I don't think we're past hope. I think we could be at a turning point.
Well, when you talked about a common human nature that's universal, that there's a we, I said, once you talk about a universal human nature rather than a human happenstance, then you might ask where it comes from. Mm-hmm. And then before you know it, you've got a creator and natural law. And we have to come to terms with the awful fact that sometimes we want things that are not good for us, and we'll have to become accountable to truth and goodness. And before you know it, you're obliged to lead a moral life. And as the millennials say, adulting is really hard, and adulting in across the horizon of eternity is even harder. And before you know it, you would need a community of truth finding and maybe support of spirit and the arts and so on. I think you're asking an awful lot, Doctor, but we'll talk about that more in the next segment. Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Molly Oshatz. She's Senior Fellow and Director of High School Programs for the Zephyr Institute for the Study of First Principles. We're responding to our article about college without truth. In the next segment, we're going to talk about what does it mean to live in a post-truth context. Is that even possible? After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Be part of the conversation. Follow what we're following by following us on Gab. That's gab.com. Our channel is The Catholic Current. Everything you need to take this conversation to your family and friends. Together we can take it around the world. We certainly cannot do it without you. Friends, we'll be back in just 2 minutes. Please do stay with us. This is Jesuit Father Robert McTague. During the upcoming fund drive running September 27th through October 1st, I will be answering some of your questions on faith, morals, and culture. You can send emails to info@thestationofthecross.com, submit a question on our website, or select the Record a Testimonial option on the iCatholic Radio app. I look forward to answering your submitted questions on the air during our fall on-air appeal running September 27th through October 1st.
After today's broadcast, go to the Catholic Current show page on thestationofthecross.com for info on today's guests, the show resource links, and to sign up for our weekly email of upcoming shows.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. And my guest today is Dr. Molly Oshatz. She is with the Zephyr Institute Center for the Study of First Principles. Doctor, I'm passionate about truth. I've been committed to truth. I've been reading great books with great mentors for all of my adult life. It seems to be more and more of a minority position. I was talking to a fellow Jesuit recently who was in conflict with someone who should know better, and as I was offering arguments for him to offer in the conversation, he said, no, you don't understand. We're living in a post-truth context. We're dealing now with the mystery of iniquity. What are your thoughts on that? Is this a desperate rearguard action? Do we want to just die with honor, or do you think there's a real chance that we can push back against the anti-truth culture?
It's a big push. I think you're pushing back a bit. So many forces that are conspiring here. So mm-hmm. It's what we've been talking about. It's also in a way consumer capitalism. It is saying like you don't need limits, right? And truth that's not open to change, truth that's objective and real and is beyond your particular interest, is a form of limit. You mentioned limits before, that right. Openness to the transcendentals implies limit. And you're absolutely right. I think that gets the heart of what's so difficult about this, is you're asking, and the way out of all the fake news and the shaming and the arguing and the violence is truth, but it's also limit.
Right.
And limits are a hard sell. But, I think there's some good news here. I mean, you do see people yearning. It's the religious communities that impose a lot of difficult sacrifices and limits that actually end up thriving. It's the ones that make it super easy that end up fading away. So there is, again, as there's that hunger for truth, I think on some level there is a hunger for limitation. Interest in fasting, for instance, these days among so many people. But that is the path. It's the wide downhill path is not the one to be on. So how do you get people to walk uphill is basically what we're asking here, to invite in a life that, doesn't impose moral and epistemological limits on you.
I've been affiliated with a number of institutions whose strategy was, we've got the best tasting bland you've ever tasted. And that doesn't go anywhere. And people think that freedom is only license. You need to have a freedom from illusion, freedom from seduction, freedom from addiction, and that includes things like self-control and fasting and discipline and so on. And that leads to a great freedom for. There is a freedom for truth, beauty, goodness, joy, self-transcendence, intimacy that's available on the condition that you have those negative freedoms of discipline. I mean, no one looks at a ballerina or a figure skater who is performing perfectly and say, isn't it tragic that she's able to do that? No one says that. So there is a human excellence there that actually can be achieved beginning in this life. And it's a costly path, but it's a path that leads to joy and to freedom. So if you've got a classroom of high school freshmen, how do you begin to make the sale that there's something other than getting lots of likes on Instagram? One of the reasons I know there's a God is I've never had to teach high school students. I mean, even college freshmen, I don't think they've reached the age of reason yet, and I've become more curmudgeon as I've gotten older. But how would you begin to make that sale for the transcendent with a group of 14 and 15-year-olds?
Depending on the group, and I do get a strange group of kids, admittedly, that I get this group of fascinating kids who want to do philosophy voluntarily, so I might not be the best person to ask here. But you're right. There is, we have a dopamine-addicted generation, right, who it tends to identify freedom with dopamine hits, something that sense of release and that sense of likes, getting likes. And it's terrifying because, I'm terrified raising my kids. I can't keep them away from this stuff entirely because it's how you communicate with the world these days. Mm-hmm. So I think we need to have almost like a how-to, like this is how your brain and your mind and your soul work. If you surround yourself with these constant hits of dopamine, and that's what you're pursuing, and that's what you're identifying as freedom, you are doing damage to yourself, and in so many different levels, and levels that we can explain in scientific language and moral language. And I think most compellingly, as you mentioned, the language of you're making excellence impossible. That excellence involves some form of self-binding, self-control, some form of rigor, and demanding that of them. I think, a lot of people, when we approach high school students, we approach young college students, the idea is if I get them on my side, I need to make this as cool and as hip and as quote-unquote relevant as possible. You can't be cooler and hipper and more relevant than what they're surrounding themselves with, constantly on phones and whatever. That's not the path. The path is, this is something excellent that's going to kick your butt. This is going to be really, really hard.
Right.
And it's going to get you to a place where you will be something new. Like this is part of putting one foot in front of the other. And at the end of this year, you'll be someplace you couldn't even imagine. It's that kind of sell as opposed to trying to take the easy path. Because again, there is something compelling about that steep path up.
That's exactly how I would start my opening lectures for pretty much every course that I taught, especially the required courses. I said, look, if you're here in this class because the grown-ups are making you shoehorn in 3 more credits in philosophy, you absolutely do not want to be in my class. I said, my grade curve is an inverted bell curve. I said, you either do screamingly well because you worked yourself to death, or you go down in flames because you didn't work yourself to death. And there's nothing in the middle. There is no safe place. I said, I'm a Jesuit. I'm incapable of half measures. Most of our saints are martyrs. So if you want to find out how good your best can be, you'll never meet a professor who worked harder than me to help you achieve your absolute best. And if you're not interested in that, do us both a favor and leave now. My self-esteem is pretty robust. I can take that hit, and you won't be miserable. let's do it that way. And there were people who really did bail. I take it as a badge of honor that more often than not, the director of athletics would direct the scholar athletes away from my class for a variety of reasons. But there are those kids who really do have a hunger for excellence. Can you talk a little bit about the before and after? You know, a kid who's got a good disposition, but not much else. After a semester at the Zephyr Institute, what's the likely difference?
So lately I've been working most with the high school students, and I do see. I mean, I try to not get kids whose parents make them be there, because it's disastrous for
right.
Group morale to have some people that you're having to draw into discussion on pain of death. But even those kids, you see a difference. Particularly, we do a camp every summer that's like week long, and it's intense. It's 5 or 6 hours of philosophy every day for a week. We have some fun too, but it's pretty intense. And at the beginning, there's a sense of like, oh my gosh, this is all like, it's apathy. It's not, it's what you mentioned, that there's kids that didn't read those great, that haven't been prepared for the great books. It's not just like reading, it's going to change it. There's a sort of like, why are we even asking these questions? It's Pontius Pilate. It's what is truth? It's not something I concern myself with. By the end of the week, that's off the table. It's very clear that something very real is at stake. Okay. That there's an encounter with being, that I have to have something to say about this. That this is a forced decision. It's live and it's forced, and either way I go on this, it's going to impact my life. I mean, ideas do have that power. And so yes. By the end of the week, even if they're not the best interlocutor, they're awakened to something that they will have to think about. They don't really have a choice, because either way it's a decision. And that's what I try to do.
That's, it sounds very much like what I would do in the classroom. I'd say there are people who want to hurt you and eat your soul. Be prepared or be surprised. But I can help you. I'm kind of the defense against the dark arts teacher from Harry Potter. Dr. Molly Oshatz of the Zephyr Institute for Center for Study of First Principles, thank you for being a splendid guest. I hope we can have another on-air conversation.
I'd love that. Thank you so much, Father.
I'm Jesuit Father Robert McTighe, your host here every day here at the Catholic Current. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Join us tomorrow for another great conversation. May Almighty God bless you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Go in peace, and please pray for me.
Thank you for listening to this podcast brought to you by thestationofthecross.com, a listener-funded nonprofit organization. Please prayerfully consider donating at thestationofthecross.com by calling 1-877-888-6279 or through our free iCatholic Radio mobile app.